All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to SIG Auth for November 28th, 2018. It looks like we do not have any announcements today unless anyone has something that's not on the agenda.
I did want to mention that the release is wrapping up, and if people want to look at what we are calling out for SIG Auth, the release notes draft is up. I will put a link to that. You can take a look at what we're calling out if you have any comments.
All right. Thanks, Jordan. Let's go to the demos. Who is presenting Kube RBAC proxy?
That's me. Let me share my screen. Yeah, so Kube RBAC proxy is actually a component that I started writing about a year ago, actually at KubeCon in Austin. I don't exactly remember who gave me the idea. I think Stefan Szymanski or something did. Someone did. And yeah, so I started working on that because I work on instrumentation things. And more specifically, I'm also part of the Prometheus team. And specifically on Kubernetes, we had the problem that we had to protect metrics endpoints, more specifically in the context of Kubernetes, like cluster components. And this seemed to be a reoccurring thing for every component, and every component seemed to be solving it more or less the same way. And so we wanted to solve this for other cluster add-ons as well. For example, there's a component called kube state metrics, for example, under the Kubernetes project, which has pretty sensitive information. Essentially, it converts more or less every Kubernetes object in a cluster to metrics, and does that more or less cluster-wide. And so if anyone had access to that metrics endpoint, that would mean they essentially have view access to the cluster. So that definitely needs to be secured. And so we were looking at how existing components do this, and I'm sure all of you know how this works with the kubelet and the API server. So I won't go into too much detail. But we essentially extracted exactly this code from Kubernetes, and essentially the kube RBAC proxy offers like client certificate authentication, the service account token, and just recently also verifying OIDC tokens. It doesn't have any of the mechanisms to obtain an OIDC token, only to verify it. And then for authorization, obviously that uses the subject access review API. You can all see my screen, right? Okay. And then in the case of this being a token, we use the token review API. So we first ask what user is this, if this user is actually valid, and so on. And then we use the subject access review. And then we actually do, like, only if all of these succeed, we actually proxy through the upstream. So in this case, this is kube state metrics. And the configuration is actually super simple. It's essentially the exact same struct that is being used within Kubernetes, and that just has the object that is being accessed or the non-resource URL that is being accessed. And this can be statically configured or be based on the request itself. And we actually use this pretty heavily in OpenShift starting in 3.11. It's also used in a widely used stack where like this Prometheus is basically a bundle that bundles like all the resources together to run Kubernetes, Prometheus on Kubernetes to monitor everything that is in Kubernetes. And overall, over the image repositories that we have, we see about 13,000 holds per day. So let's jump into a very quick demo for this. So I have a Minikube cluster here, and I'm just going to create a kube-rbac proxy with a non-resource URL as the configured subject access review to be checked. So I create that. You see it running?
We can't see your screen.
Oh, you can't. Okay, let me fix that. Can you see it now?
Yep.
Okay. So as you can see here, I created a deployment that has the kube-rbac proxy and another container inside, which it will proxy to if everything is successful. So we can see that it's started. So I'll run a container to curl that one. So I use the token, and we can see that I am authenticated indeed, but I'm not allowed to do this. And so if I do grant my service account the appropriate permissions, then I should start to see this working soon. Let's see what it says. Ah, there it is. Just took. So we can see that this works correctly. Now it proxies through correctly, and we see the metrics output, which is what we were requesting here. So yeah, that was just a very quick demo to show how this is essentially intended to work and that it does work. And let me switch back to my presentation. I guess you probably already know, and this is the same reason or the same thing with the kubelet. The problem is that if the proxy is getting the plaintext token, then it can use that to impersonate the requesting Prometheus, for example. So we have to make sure that this is essentially only with the service account token is only used with targets that already have higher permissions than Prometheus, so that it wouldn't be a privilege escalation. This would be the case for kube state metrics, for example, or the kubelet or the controller manager or stuff like that. So yeah, we are looking forward to having audience validation for this because that would solve a lot of these problems. But that said, it would probably just be better if people used TLS certificates for this instead. Yeah, so that's some of the future work that we want to work on. As soon as token audience essentially exists upstream, we want to implement that in the kube-rbac proxy as well. And the reason I'm here right now is because a couple of people have approached me and have asked, because a lot of people are using this, if I would want to have this on some sort of a neutral ground. And first of all, I think that seems pretty natural in terms of the topic of the project. And more practically, I think what would be really nice is this is a security component currently under like my user on GitHub. It's pretty hard for me as a single person to have a good security escalation process, and the Kubernetes project itself already has a good one, and having multiple people behind this would help as well. And obviously collaboration would be great, but that's not an expectation. I'm more than happy to continue to maintain it. So yeah, that was basically already the next point on the agenda that we wanted to discuss this. Yeah, I guess the discussion for that is open now. If you want, I can leave my screen shared, but that's it.
So as a point of reference, we were investigating using this as one of the kind of recommended deployment models for controllers generated with KubeBuilder for protecting the metrics endpoints.
I have a question. So where is this proxy being deployed?
This would be, typically it's like next to the application in the same pod.
I see. Have you ever looked at Istio or Envoy? I think the model is very similar to Istio and Envoy model.
Yes, this was specifically done to like reuse the Kubernetes authentication mechanisms because it's meant for Kubernetes components themselves.
It also provides a nice option if you're not running a service mesh, right? Like if you just want to secure a few of your add-on components and you have other setups otherwise, or you have other components where you can't run a service mesh, then you can drop this in place and use this to secure your add-ons, metric endpoints, for instance, and then whatever, you can use whatever else for the rest of your stuff. But if you are running a service mesh, you could hypothetically forgo this and use your service mesh to secure communication between your metrics endpoints and Prometheus or what have you.
I see. So the main use case is if you don't run a service mesh and you want to directly use the Kubernetes provided authentication and authorization.
Yes, as I mentioned though, like if this is being used with service account tokens, as long as audience scoping doesn't exist, it's probably not a good idea to use this for your applications. But for cluster components, this should be safe to use.
I see. Thanks.
So Solly specifically was asking if this could be under Kubernetes SIGs, and as far as I understand, that would probably require a sponsor from SIG Auth. Yeah, so.
I have a couple more questions. Does it do delegated authentication to the main API server using token review?
Yes.
That's already supported.
Yeah. That was one of the slides I skipped. Maybe I should have not skipped that. Yeah. So if you configure it to do token authentication, it will use the token review API first, and if that is successful, so if you have successfully authenticated, then it will use the subject access review API.
It was unclear whether that was planned for when audience support lands in token review.
Yeah, it does have this right now already, but the point that I was trying to make with the audience review was that it would be better to have that in terms of the
much better.
Yeah.
That's in 113, so soon enough.
Is it? That's awesome. I wasn't aware that it actually did land. Cool.
And the OIDC support, is that kind of duplicated with, or it provides duplicate functionality of what the Kubernetes API server does?
Yeah, it's essentially the exact, like we literally import the same packages from Kubernetes to do this. The idea was just that the external, like an external OIDC provider could be used for this instead of the one that Kubernetes may be using.
And what is the general approach to provisioning serving certificates for kubeRBAC proxy?
For kubeRBAC proxy, that's not within the scope. So like it expects the user to provision certificates.
What does the user have to do in order to make that happen?
It's just a file that needs to be configured.
Do you know what people are generally doing? Because I assume that kubeRBAC proxy fronts pods behind services. Are people using the clusters certificate APIs to make that happen? It seems potentially like a tricky problem.
So within OpenShift, at least, we use something that we built for OpenShift, which is called the Serving Certs Controller, which basically has a separate certificate authority for serving servers, essentially, that is mounted into each pod, like the CA itself is. Yeah, and then you can basically request a certificate on a per service basis, I think. Yeah. So that's what we do. I'm not sure exactly what users are doing.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it seems useful. I think it kind of hits a sweet spot as far as taking advantage of existing capabilities and being well positioned to use some of the stronger capabilities like audience finding once we have it available. I don't know. I kind of see the service mesh and this being two sides of the same problem and kind of addressing the same need for different audiences, which seems useful.
Yeah, I agree.
What is a service mesh? That term is so vague. Are we talking about like existing full-fledged solutions like Istio, or I mean, I could interpret it as a bunch of services running kube RBAC proxy to communicate with each other. So I think there's varying degrees of all-in that help you build a secure system of services.
Yeah, I guess I would say something like Istio, where the authority and trust structure is not Kubernetes dependent.
Actually, I completely share your your thought there, because if you look at other things that call themselves service meshes, like Linkerd, for example, they don't take care of certificate provisioning at all, and they just position themselves as something that has lots of metrics and is therefore observable. So I think there's varying degree of what makes a service mesh.
I think my only feedback would be if we sort of adopted this for SIG Auth, like being really clear about the current state and what is recommended and what isn't, and what changes are coming and should be adopted before people started using this for various use cases. If it's under a Kubernetes SIG, people are more likely to say, "Oh, it's an auth proxy. I can use it for anything." And like we know the shortcomings with the current setup, but just making sure those are front and center and say this is reasonable to use for these use cases. It's not reasonable for these use cases yet.
Yeah. So I think everything that we have discussed is depicted in the README, but I'm more than happy to go through with everyone again and make sure that it is up to the standard. Like, I mean, we don't necessarily need to discuss that now. I can follow up and share everything in the SIG Auth channel on Slack, and then we can do it synchronously. Yeah.
So I did have some questions real quick. First, does it really need the word RBAC in the name? Right, it's orthogonal to the way you have authorization, right?
Well,
it does both steps, right? Like it
Yeah.
allows you to easily consume Kubernetes authentication and authorization.
Yeah.
Authorization, yes, but it isn't technically RBAC dependent. It's using subject access reviews. Was that your point, Mo?
Yes. Yes, it was.
I understand where you're coming from. I still think, like, I'm not bound to the name at all. I think users there through the name understood what it's about, even if it's not technically correct. But yeah, I'm not bound to the name by any means.
Yeah, it was just a comment. It wasn't like a criticism or anything. I just, when I saw it initially, I was like, there's no RBAC here. The other thing I wanted to ask is, how does this sort of relate to, I think, Mike, you had a doc recently about component config and sort of the desire to have a very specific way that we configure things. And one of those bits was, delegated authentication and authorization. would the idea be that you use something like this when you want like the extra OIDC bits and the extra SAR checking? I guess because I suppose it I suppose they solve different things. One of them is protecting something, and the other one is more general authentication authorization configuration.
Yeah, there's two concerns that seem to be bundled, which is not necessarily a bad thing. You could delegate authentication without delegating authorization. That would be equivalently useful. I'm definitely interested in this project. I would love to see it add support for token review, which is now token review with an audience verification, which is now in master. And I'd like to understand advice to, if we can give advice to users on how to provision this with HTTPS enabled easily. And I would like to understand what the drawbacks are of running this in HTTP mode without TLS or server authentication. I think those are the big gaps for me right now.
Can it run in non-TLS mode?
It can, but I think all the examples that exist use HTTPS, and it does, similar to most Kubernetes components, if no certificate is given, but you wanted to listen on HTTPS basically, then it will generate a certificate on the fly. Yeah. But I do know there are some users, I just remembered, some users are using Cert Manager within the cluster to provision certificates for this.
Yeah, so I think maybe a quick review of kind of what the defaults are. Taking, if we change the repo or the version as part of adoption by the SIG, maybe taking that opportunity to review some of the defaults, make sure the defaults go the way we want to encourage usage. And then, yeah, just reviewing the README. And since it is somewhat corresponding in time with when the audience binding reviews are available, we might even want to update the default examples to use that as part of this, and then have a note to say, against older versions, this isn't available, and you should not use it for these use cases because of that.
Yeah, I think that all makes perfect sense. How do you want to go about that kind of review? Do you just want to do it, like kick it off on Slack, or should I start like an issue on the repo and tag everyone?
Probably do an issue and start a thread on the mailing list, and that way it'll be kind of recorded and it'll reach everybody whether they're online at the time or not. And
that sounds perfect. Yeah.
Get through that and then get feedback on the adoption. It sounds like people are generally in favor of seeing this progress, and it kind of makes sense.
Cool. Okay. Thanks.
As part of the adoption, we should also make sure that the Docker images get pushed to the official Kubernetes Docker repo. I'm actually not sure what the process for non-core subprojects is for that.
So actually, even for core projects, that's necessarily automated. So as I said, I do maintain the kube state metrics project, which is under the Kubernetes org. And I do have to ping Google employees to push new images. So I was I think around the 1.6 Kubernetes timeframe, I was told this was going to be possible for non-Google employees, but it's not yet.
I thought they did a release for the main repository that didn't involve Google employees, maybe last release.
Interesting. I haven't heard anything, but we don't need to get caught up in that right now.
Cool.
All right, let's move on to the next agenda item. Patrick, are you on the call?
Yep, I'm here.
All right, take it away.
Yep, let me share my screen real quick. So we're looking at a way to authorize webhooks going out of the API server to whatever the end client may be. Just a way of verifying that it is the API server that sent these requests over. So the immediate use case is dynamic audit went into alpha in 1.13. We're currently, sending out audit via webhook. But we are really on the client side, you have no way of knowing no way of knowing if the API server is what sent those events. So someone could technically get onto the cluster, mock an audit event, and now you have a corrupted stream. So this is looking at ways that we can potentially authenticate those calls going outward. It's still very early. We're just kind of poking around at ideas, just looking more or less just to brainstorm here around like a more general direction. There's two kind of main ways we see this guy. One would be a secret, somehow linking that out to the webhook definition. This could hold potentially something like kubeconfig. Jordan had already kind of jumped in and said, we're not necessarily tied to that idea. We could do it in a more simple mechanism. There are some questions around, secrets are namespace. The webhook currently is not namespace. How do these two things interact? Same question around aggregates. Aggregates could live in a different namespace. How would that then function? Another option would be to go with the token request review API. Somehow mint a token for the API server or for the webhook itself. Provide that with a known audience, and then when receiving the events, you would have a way of checking that through the token review API. You could potentially turn that on with a runtime flag too, so it wouldn't be as tied into the API, and you could just enhance all requests with a token going outbound that would verify, have a way of verifying the audience. So just looking for general feedback on direction where we might head here. If anyone has ideas.
So my understanding, and I haven't looked in many years, is that kubeconfigs currently support a kubeconfig that configures a webhook currently supports providing authentication information, such as either using like the GCP auth provider, which we use in GKE, or a token or a client certificate. Is the proposal here to potentially use something that can be verified by the token review API? Is it specifically, is the specific concern the integrity of the audit logs?
So, there are kind of two different things, and we could take different angles here. I think number one, it's verifying that the audit logs aren't somehow corrupted. So if we could solve that in an easy manner, say using token review API, I think that's a reasonable solve. There would potentially be another solve, what you're alluding to here, and I kind of call it out up top here, was the auth info part of the kubeconfig. Maybe I have a specific API key that I want to set in that webhook to go to some third-party thing. and I need a way of injecting that, that is kind of a different scenario. Solves a different use case, but maybe more complex. Currently, Auth supports a whole bunch of things.
Yeah, this isn't just audit as well. So this is, I think a good goal is to come up with something, an approach that would work for all the various webhooks that the API server calls out to. So admission and audit, both types of admission webhooks and audit webhooks. And
Okay.
like the current approach mixes, it pulls authentication information from a kubeconfig that's given to the API server via a flag with sort of the destination information from these dynamically configured webhooks. So it's,
Right.
and the reason for that is that we can't assume that all the API servers looking at a particular dynamic webhook config object in the API are going to use the same credentials or should have access to the same credentials. So that's why there's this kind of odd mixing of API-driven destinations with flag-provided credentials.
Okay, so this is primarily for webhooks that usually call back into the cluster.
Not
Not
necessarily.
necessarily.
I guess I could be a part of it, but if we are trying to make it more generic, I don't necessarily think it would go that route. It's just, yeah, anything going outbound, the API server or an aggregate calling outward, or sending some sort of data or making a call outward.
I was going to call out to, another kind of like dangerous thing. So if we go down the kubeconfig route, get an echo from someone. Thanks, Tim. One other kind of dangerous thing is that those kubeconfig files can have like run commands in them. And so they're really not something you would want somebody to dynamically specify and have the API server load.
Yeah, I think a good first step would probably be to lay out the different use cases that we have. So I called out a couple there, like where you want each API server to have sort of per server, per webhook, have the ability to have per server, per webhook credentials and how you would accomplish that. And then the use case you laid out where you're calling out to some external webhook that says you must use token 123, and you just like, how would you accomplish making all the servers use token 123 when they called out to this webhook? Maybe it's not a particularly sensitive thing to share among your API servers. Are we going to make it insanely painful to go configure a bunch of servers to use this single token to call an external hook?
Right.
Those are a couple use cases. And then thinking about like what could be on the other end. Things that aren't Kubernetes aware probably aren't going to be able to do much with a token request generated token.
Or if it's a shared endpoint.
Yeah. Whereas things that are token aware are Kubernetes aware, a token request token that's audience specific and server specific, or at least service account specific, could be perfect. Like that might be super useful.
Right.
So laying out sort of the use cases on both ends, and then we can start thinking through how we could make this as easy as possible, but also not steal power from administrators if they need to give credentials to things that aren't Kubernetes aware on a per API server basis.
Is there any precedent for having something like, a cluster skipped object referencing a namespace skipped thing?
Sure. Persistent volumes can reference secrets.
Okay.
And so they reference, it's a fully qualified reference. They have to indicate the name and the namespace.
Okay.
But for things like that, it's always like a one-to-one relationship. Like everything that is responsible for a particular persistent volume is expected to be able to read the secrets needed to mount it or attach it or whatever. For the webhooks, that's not the case. Like you would not assume that all API servers that are supposed to be logging audit events should be using a shared credential to do so.
Right, because you'd have to jump across namespaces, which makes it really, really tricky.
So I think the old saying, like make simple things simple and make complex things possible, probably holds here. Like if we have capabilities for generating per audience, per server tokens using token request, and we want to make it really easy for webhooks to opt into that and say, like, when you call me, go get a token for my service as an audience and pass it to me. Like,
right.
And that solves 50% or 70% of the things that are going to be running in cluster with like no external config. That might be a reasonable step. But then also thinking through how you would direct API servers to use per server credentials that are not sort of automatic Kubernetes tokens that we can generate. Anyway.
Okay, yeah. I think high level that gives us at least movement to get forward. We'll dig in deeper on both these and, you know, think through it a bit more and probably come back with you guys in the next month or so.
One thing to keep in mind too is that API machinery is pretty involved in these. So it's worth copying them. If you start a thread on the list or open an issue, I would share the docs and issues with them as well.
Okay, will do. Thank you.
Thanks. CJ, do you want to take the next one or do you want me to present?
I'd love it if you could present. I've never actually screen shared from you before, but I can talk through it.
Oh, or actually, Jordan, if you still
have
yeah. The agenda open.
You also have trouble presenting.
We're good with technology, really.
Trust us. All right, so Tim and I have a session at the Developer Summit 2 weeks from now on Monday here in Seattle on the state of security. It's kind of our chance to tell people about what's been going on in SIG Auth and maybe bring other people's focus to anything that we think is interesting or important currently or in the next year or whatever. So we put together an outline of kind of what we want to talk about. I think we got bumped down to a 35-minute session. Is that right, Tim?
I think it maybe is TBD, somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes.
Yeah. So we may have to cut stuff, but our high-level thinking was start with a look back. Working in this space, it's often, you know, frustrating to look to see progress because half your time is spent staring at fires and the other half is spent trying to get people to adopt features that they think are breaking them. So I think it's important that we take a look back at the last few years and look how far we've come, kind of rah stuff there. In that vein.
Interject for a second. One of the high-level messages we wanted to get across, since this is to the whole Kubernetes community and not just SIG Auth, is that security, Kubernetes security isn't just a SIG Auth responsibility, that it's really a community effort and trying to highlight some of the features that were done in addition to just the SIG Auth features, and then also trying to get the message across that really we need help from all of the other SIGs as well. Sorry, CJ, carry on.
No, thanks. Yeah, so we were gonna kind of talk through like some of the very early iterations of Kubernetes where you really had to trust everything interacting with your cluster, from all your developers to all your applications. and how kind of a year later, maybe a year or so ago, we were in a position where we could credibly say you can set up a secure edge cluster. There were still a lot of shortcomings, that it's hard, it's easy to mess up, and a lot of those things are sort of one layer of protection that certain bugs or misconfigurations can expose you to things that are scary. And then we're going to talk through some of the CVEs that we've come across in the last few years, because those are kind of fun and exciting and also scary. And that leads us into talking about some of the focus of stuff we're doing today, which is more on hardening and encouraging best practices and sane defaults. And then moving into the stuff that we're thinking about going forward. I guess I'll just let people read this stuff. So the hot issues that were obviously the service account stuff that has been coming up in SIG Auth meetings over the past while, as well as the sandboxing and the, I don't know if I want to call it the final steps on node isolation, but really rounding out the story of how to isolate privilege based on what nodes things are running, and then also some of the updates on what the PST is doing.
Also, in this section, this isn't meant to be a complete list of all of the important work that is happening in security. We specifically wanted to focus on kind of cross-cutting features and things that might affect folks outside of SIG Auth.
Might be good to link to sort of umbrella issues or points where if people want to find out more, they have a single spot to jump to.
Yeah, definitely.
Do we, I see the stated goals. Do we want to ask for anything?
No bugs, no more bugs, anybody.
Just informational. Well, I mean, there's one line in open issues, which is better defaults and migration, which basically affects everybody if we start ratcheting down default behavior. I think that's a issue that it affected Node the last couple of releases with the label and taint lockdown. It'll affect API machinery if we ever move to a projected volume for service account tokens. It's this security profile work that's been really tedious, difficult, and potentially impossible to do without breaking behavior that exists.
Yeah, exactly. So actually, that was our goal for the open issues section.
Yeah.
Sort of the third main chunk of the talk is to highlight some of the issues where we really need help from the community and kind of big gnarly problems that are going to be sort of hard and painful to solve. And so that is sort of where we're saying these are our sort of asks to the community.
Yeah, the highlight reel is nice, but selfishly, I want people to help us. So I think that the open issues is definitely a very important section.
I think that the GoDevs will be particularly salient, and it is one of those things where anybody committing large chunks of code that has to rely on external libraries at all, we want them to think about that.
Yep.
Yeah, for the defaults and migration bits, I think figuring out a vision for making the configuration of our binaries more principled. Today, it's like a bunch of flags with various defaults, and some of the defaults are bad, and there's not super clear or principled approaches to changing those defaults. If our binaries were driven by config that was versioned, then suddenly like version timelines and deprecation and like that is something people are more familiar with. You can do things like, say, in version 2 of the API server config, the defaults are to use bound tokens and to not allow allow all requests by default, and things like that. And once version 2 of the config is available, you can say version 1 is deprecated and will be removed in X releases. Like it's just clearer what people are currently using and what moving to the next version means, and you can start to do things like write tools like the kind that we were wanting for the security profiles. If we speak a common language about how we're running these components, we can analyze your configs and say, oh, well, you're using insecure defaults, and you should upgrade to version 2, and you should do this, and you should change this. Like we have a common language we can use to evaluate things and recommend things, and even help walk people through upgrades. If you're going to upgrade and you want to start using bound tokens, well, now you have to provide signing keys to your API server. And we could really easily look at the config and say, oh, you're not currently providing these. Here are the changes you need to make. Here's the information you need to provide. And we can do that in a way that works for everybody's deployment, as opposed to what we have today, which is like a bunch of flags in environment variables, in systemd unit files, inside of manifests, inside of bash scripts. So I think becoming more principled about our config and actually using the versioning process to improve defaults, which is what we've done for our REST APIs as well. We said some of the defaults in V1 were terrible. We're going to leave these objects around forever and flood etcd, and we've improved those defaults in V2. The same kind of thing with our config, I think, is what we will probably need to push for. So for anyone who's interested, there is the component config work that saw a lot of action in 1.12 and then kind of stalled out. Getting that going again and getting some motion for the components that don't yet consume config files, I think would get us going in a direction where we could make traction on some of these issues.
Yeah, definitely agree with all of that. And our hope is that by kind of presenting this in the contributor summit, we can get folks outside of this community, in the broader community, kind of understanding why this is so important and what some of the challenges are, and hopefully recruit some folks to work on things like component config.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't immediately see the security benefits of even the GoDeps thing, but especially like having a sane way to reason about defaults is a security feature.
Yep.
A lot of people just see it as like, oh yeah, that'd be nice, but like whatever, people that operate Kubernetes are smart enough that they'll just figure everything out. Yeah, so go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say, sort of in conclusion, our asks to the SIG Auth community are look to see if there are any kind of big milestones or features that you feel like are missing from our from sort of our retrospective and our works in progress, or if you feel like there are big cross-cutting issues that are going to be need to be tackled in 2019, then this is also a good place to call it out. And any other kind of feedback you have on this would be greatly appreciated. Also, just to mention, we'll be presenting this at the Contributor Summit in the KubeCon in Seattle on, I think it's December 9th, December 10th, something like that. If you aren't going to be able to make it, the talks will be recorded. Anything else to say on that, CJ?
No, I'm good. Thanks.
All right, Clayton, to you. if you are on the call.
I don't know if he ever joined the call. I spent a lot of time talking to him earlier today, and he said he had something for today, but maybe he forgot.
Something.
I'm assuming this was about the kubelet bootstrapping pull request that almost made it into 113, but then did not.
Perhaps, but he did not specify.
Okay. I can describe that briefly if you want. If it's something else, then you can come back in 2 weeks or 4 weeks and talk about it. There was a pull request that restructured or decoupled kubelet client bootstrapping from the kubelet running static pods. So that if you think about it, the kubelet does basically 3 things. It runs pods that are given to it in pod manifests on disk. That's 1. It runs pods that it pulls from the API server. That's 2. And it serves endpoints by which you can exec and attach and get pod logs and things like that. So that's 3. And logically, the kubelet doesn't need a connection to the API server in order to run the static pods on disk. And so it happened to be waiting until it had bootstrapped and gotten API client credentials before it started running static pods. But there wasn't a real reason for that. It just happened that that's how the startup flow worked. And that was actually blocking some like self-hosting use cases. I think the kubeatom, the way kubeatom runs the kubelet on the masters, I had to do some kind of duplicate work because of that. Anyway, I'll link to the poll that unblocked running static pods if anyone is interested, but that should land in 114 and let you start a single kubelet and run static pods prior to there being an API server even available, which is nice.
Should help with startup latency too.
All right, looks like that's everything. Any final thoughts? I think that our next, so our next SIG Auth meeting is right in the middle of KubeCon Seattle. So I suspect that we will cancel that one. After that is in the midst of the holidays. So this might be our last meeting until the new year. Yeah, I hope everyone has a good December. Thanks all.
Thanks.
Thanks.